"She is just a housewife," my stepson said loudly enough for every stranger in that courtroom to hear. And the soft ripple of laughter that followed felt heavier than any verdict that could have been read that morning. I did not turn to look at him. I did not defend myself. Instead, I kept my eyes on the polished wooden rail in front of me, tracing the faint scratches carved by decades of anxious hands, and I let the silence become my shield. At 72, I had learned that dignity is often mistaken for weakness by those who have never had to fight quietly. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and floor wax, the kind of scent that lingers in government buildings where lives are rearranged with the strike of a gavel. Outside the tall windows, late autumn sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps, bright and indifferent, as if the world had no interest in the small humiliation unfolding inside. Daniel shifted in his seat beside his attorney, his expensive suit fitting him like confidence itself. He leaned back, one ankle resting casually over his knee, as though this hearing were nothing more than a tedious business appointment he intended to win. When he laughed again, softer this time, I could hear the impatience behind it. To him this was already over. To him I was already gone. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the familiar tremor that came whenever memory and present moment collided. For 40 years I had woken before sunrise to prepare breakfasts, to pack lunches, to iron shirts that would be worn into boardrooms and classrooms and airports far from the quiet kitchen where my own ambitions had slowly cooled like forgotten coffee. I had told myself it was love. I had told myself it was family. And in many ways it had been. When I married Robert Whitmore, Daniel was just 8 years old. A serious boy with wary eyes who watched me from the staircase as if I were an uninvited guest who might rearrange the furniture of his life. I had knelt down that first evening, smoothing the wrinkles from his rumpled school jacket, promising him I would never try to replace his mother. I would simply be there. Over time he had come to call me Margaret instead of Mrs. Whitmore, and later sometimes Mom when he needed something signed or mended or quietly forgiven. Those small victories had felt like sunlight breaking through long winters. Now, decades later, I sat 3 rows behind him in a room filled with strangers, listening to him reduce my life to a single dismissive word. Housewife. As if the thousands of ordinary acts that hold a family together were invisible threads no one bothers to notice until they snap. The judge had not yet entered, and the murmur of conversations floated around me like static. A young woman in the gallery scrolled through her phone, her manicured nails tapping against the screen with a rhythm that sounded oddly like a countdown. Somewhere behind me, a man cleared his throat repeatedly, the sound dry and impatient. I became aware of the weight of my handbag resting against my side, the worn leather softened by years of use. Inside it, carefully arranged in a manila folder, were documents Daniel had never imagined I would find. Papers that had arrived on a quiet Tuesday night when the wind rattled the kitchen windows and the house felt too large for one person to inhabit. I could still see the envelope lying on the welcome mat like an accusation, its return address printed in crisp black ink that meant nothing to me at first glance. I had almost left it there until morning. Almost. That night, I brewed a pot of tea I never drank and sat at the dining table where Robert and I had once hosted holiday dinners that lasted for hours. The overhead light cast a lonely circle across the wood grain as I unfolded page after page, my heartbeat steady even as my understanding began to shift. There are moments in life when truth does not arrive with a shout, but with a quiet, deliberate knock. You can choose not to answer. You can pretend you did not hear it. Or you can open the door and step into whatever waits on the other side. I chose to open it. In the weeks that followed, I learned to move through my own home like a guest. Daniel had started coming by unannounced, his voice brisk and efficient as he discussed renovations I had never agreed to and financial decisions he presented as inevitable. He spoke about the future in a way that did not include me. I responded with nods and careful questions, storing away every detail the way a librarian files away fragile books. When he changed the locks on the back door, he explained it was for my safety. When he suggested selling Robert's study furniture, he said it would simplify things. Simplify. Such a gentle word for erasure. Now, as the courtroom door opened and everyone rose to their feet, I felt a calm settle over me that surprised even myself. The judge stepped onto the bench, his robe moving like dark water, his expression composed and unreadable. Daniel straightened, smoothing his tie with the confidence of a man who believes he understands every variable in the room. I remained still for one heartbeat longer than necessary before standing, the faint creak of the wooden pew marking my presence in a way my stepson's laughter never could. I had spent a lifetime being underestimated. Today, for the first time, I intended to let that assumption work in my favor. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reviewing the case file with a calm deliberation that seemed to stretch time itself. And as the attorneys organized their notes and whispered to their clients, I allowed my gaze to wander across the familiar architecture of authority that surrounded us, the high ceiling that made voices sound smaller than their owners intended, the American flag standing motionless in the corner like a silent witness to generations of human certainty and human error. And I thought about how many times in my life I had sat in rooms like this without anyone realizing the quiet role I had played in shaping the minds that would one day occupy the seats of power. Daniel's attorney cleared his throat and began outlining their argument in confident, well-rehearsed tones, speaking of efficiency and rightful succession and the practical realities of property management as though my existence were an inconvenient footnote in an otherwise straightforward transaction. And Daniel nodded along with the faint smile of someone who believes he is being reasonable, who believes he has extended every courtesy that could be expected, who believes that compassion is a resource best spent on futures rather than on memories. I listened without interruption, folding my hands once more in my lap and noticing how steady they had become since the night the envelope arrived, since the moment I realized that the life I had carefully constructed around family, dinners and shared holidays and whispered encouragement at kitchen tables had been quietly reinterpreted by the next generation as something disposable, something that could be rearranged or relocated like outdated furniture. Outside the courthouse windows a delivery truck rumbled past, its engine vibrating faintly through the floorboards, and the mundane sound grounded me in the present even as my thoughts drifted back to a time when mornings began with the sharp scent of chalk dust, and the low murmur of students filling lecture halls with restless ambition. I had once stood at the front of those rooms in sensible shoes and tailored jackets, guiding young men and women through the complexities of constitutional interpretation and ethical responsibility, urging them to see the law not as a weapon but as a framework for dignity. And I remembered one particular student who always sat in the third row, his dark hair perpetually falling into his eyes as he argued points with a sincerity that bordered on stubbornness. Andrew Collins had been brilliant and impatient, convinced that the world would yield to logic if only it were presented clearly enough, and I had challenged him to consider the quieter variables that shape human decisions, the unseen loyalties and private fears that rarely make it into textbooks. Those conversations had felt important then, but I had never imagined how they might echo decades later in a room where my own future was being debated in measured legal phrases. The attorney's voice rose slightly as he described the house on Maplewood Drive, its square footage and market value reduced to numbers that sounded strangely hollow when stripped of the laughter and arguments and midnight confessions it had sheltered for so many years, and Daniel leaned forward to add his own comments about maintenance costs and modernization plans, his tone polite but final, as though he were offering me the courtesy of explanation rather than the courtesy of choice. I noticed the way he avoided looking directly at me, the way his gaze skimmed past my face and settled instead on the polished surface of the counsel table, and I wondered whether he feared what he might see if he allowed himself to meet my eyes. Perhaps he would recognize the woman who had once waited up for him when he missed curfew, who had pressed cool cloths to his forehead during childhood fevers, who had applauded every small victory with a pride that felt as natural as breathing. Or perhaps he would see only the outline of an obstacle he had already decided to remove. The judge raised a hand, signaling a pause, and the room fell into a silence so complete that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock mounted high on the wall, each second marking the distance between who I had been and who I was about to become. In that suspended moment I felt an unexpected clarity settle over me. A realization that the years I had spent being underestimated were not a burden but a kind of preparation. A quiet apprenticeship in resilience that had taught me how to endure without spectacle, and how to act without announcement. I reached into my handbag and touched the edge of the manila folder, reassuring myself that it was still there, that the carefully gathered pages within it represented not revenge but recognition, not a desire to wound but a determination to be seen accurately at last. When the judge finally spoke, inviting my attorney to respond, I rose to my feet with a steadiness that surprised even the woman I had been only months before, and as I began to speak I realized that the room was listening in a different way now, as though some subtle shift had already begun, as though the story they thought they understood was quietly rearranging itself around truths they had not yet fully grasped. My voice did not rise when I began to speak, and that was the first thing I noticed. The way the words seemed to leave me with a quiet certainty that filled the room more effectively than any display of emotion ever could, and as I stated my name for the record I saw Daniel's shoulders shift slightly, as if the simple sound of it carried more weight than he had expected. I explained in measured detail the timeline of events that had brought us here, not as accusations but as observations, describing the gradual changes that followed Robert's passing, the new language of efficiency that replaced the old language of care, the decisions made in conference calls and email threads where my presence was no longer considered necessary. I spoke about the renovation proposals that had arrived before I had even finished sorting through my husband's belongings, about the polite suggestions that I might feel more comfortable in a smaller place, somewhere with less responsibility and fewer memories, and I allowed each sentence to settle in the silence that followed it like a stone dropped into still water. My attorney stood beside me, occasionally adding clarifications, but I could feel the attention of the courtroom shift away from legal technicalities and toward the quiet narrative unfolding in front of them, a story that was less about square footage and market trends and more about the invisible negotiations that define family loyalty. Daniel's attorney attempted to interrupt once, then thought better of it, perhaps sensing that the judge was listening in a way that transcended procedural impatience. When I reached into my handbag and removed the manila folder, I did so without drama, placing it gently on the table as though it were nothing more than a set of lecture notes prepared for an afternoon seminar. The faint rustle of paper seemed amplified in the charged stillness, and I felt a memory surface of countless evenings spent grading essays at the dining room table, red pen moving steadily across arguments that were earnest but incomplete. I had always believed that correction, when offered with respect, could be an act of kindness. Now I wondered whether truth, presented at the right moment, might serve a similar purpose. I began to describe the contents of the folder in calm, deliberate language, outlining the discrepancies in property filings and the unauthorized transfers that had been executed under the assumption that I would never think to question them. Daniel shifted again, this time more noticeably, his confidence flickering like a light briefly interrupted by passing clouds. I did not look at him. Instead, I directed my attention to the judge, meeting his gaze with the same steady composure I had once expected from students defending their thesis statements under scrutiny. There was a pause then, a subtle but unmistakable hesitation in the rhythm of the proceedings, and in that pause I saw recognition begin to take shape, not yet fully formed but unmistakably present. The judge leaned forward slightly, studying my face as though searching through a mental archive of long-forgotten classrooms and chalkboard debates, and I felt an unexpected warmth rise beneath my carefully maintained calm. It had been so many years since anyone had looked at me with that particular combination of curiosity and respect, the kind that acknowledges not just who you are in this moment, but who you have been across the unfolding chapters of a life. Daniel's attorney resumed speaking, his tone less assured now as he attempted to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding born of generational differences and practical necessity, but the narrative momentum had already begun to shift, like a tide turning almost imperceptibly before revealing its full force. I realized then that my silence in the months leading up to this hearing had not been emptiness but preparation, a gathering of fragments that now fit together with quiet inevitability. The house on Maplewood Drive was no longer merely a building under dispute. It had become a symbol of something larger, a test of whether years of devotion could be dismissed with a signature and a schedule. As I concluded my statement, I allowed myself the smallest of breaths, a private acknowledgement that the woman who had once stood at the front of lecture halls was still present within me, not diminished but refined by time. The judge's expression softened into something almost personal, and when he spoke my name again it carried a different resonance, as though he were addressing not just a litigant but a mentor whose lessons had lingered long after graduation day. Around us, the courtroom seemed to lean closer, drawn into the quiet gravity of a moment that would redefine far more than the outcome of a single case. The judge removed his glasses and set them carefully on the polished surface before him, and the simple gesture carried a gravity that seemed to draw every breath in the courtroom into a shared pause, as though we were all waiting for something unnamed but inevitable to finally take shape. When he spoke again, his voice had softened in a way that transformed the proceedings from a routine hearing into something far more personal, and I felt the past and present fold into each other like the pages of a well-worn book being reopened after years on a quiet shelf. He asked me a question that had nothing to do with square footage or market valuation, nothing to do with procedural timelines or notarized signatures, but everything to do with memory and influence and the long arc of mentorship that stretches far beyond the boundaries of any single classroom. He asked whether I had once taught constitutional ethics at Westbridge Law School, and for a brief moment the fluorescent lights above us seemed to hum louder, the air itself thickening with the realization that the story unfolding here was no longer confined to the narrow frame Daniel had imagined. I nodded slowly, feeling the familiar steadiness return to my spine, and I saw recognition fully awaken in the judge's eyes like dawn breaking across a horizon that had been hidden by fog. Around us the attorneys exchanged glances that were equal parts confusion and recalculation, while Daniel shifted in his chair with a restlessness he could no longer disguise behind practiced confidence. It is a peculiar sensation to watch someone revise their understanding of you in real time, to see the narrative they have constructed begin to fracture under the quiet pressure of facts they had never considered relevant. The judge spoke then of late evenings spent debating case studies in a lecture hall that smelled faintly of coffee and ambition, of a professor who had insisted that integrity was not an abstract ideal but a daily practice measured in small, often unseen choices. And as he described those moments I felt a warmth spread through the hollow places that months of dismissal had carved within me. I had not realized how deeply I had missed being remembered. Daniel's attorney attempted to steer the conversation back toward technicalities, clearing his throat with renewed urgency as he cited statutes and precedents, but the rhythm of the hearing had already shifted into a cadence that allowed space for human context, for the understanding that legal disputes do not arise in a vacuum, but in the complicated ecosystems of family, loyalty, and expectation. I stood quietly while the judge reviewed the documents I had presented, his brow furrowing not in hostility but in concentration, and I found myself reflecting on the night I had first discovered them, the way the kitchen clock had ticked steadily past midnight as realization settled over me like a second skin. I had not cried then. I had simply made a list. Dates to verify. Accounts to trace. Conversations to remember with greater clarity than they had perhaps been offered. That list had become my anchor in the weeks that followed. A quiet map guiding me through unfamiliar terrain where affection and strategy intertwined in ways I had never imagined I would need to navigate. Daniel finally looked at me directly. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something more fragile, and for the first time I wondered whether he was confronting not only the possibility of losing the case but the deeper discomfort of recognizing the full dimension of the woman he had so easily dismissed. The judge replaced his glasses and addressed the courtroom with a composure that carried both authority and gratitude, acknowledging the influence teachers have on shaping the ethical frameworks of those who later interpret the law. And in that acknowledgement I felt the scales of perception continue their gradual, irreversible shift. The house on Maplewood Drive remained the official subject of our dispute, yet it had become increasingly clear that what was truly being examined here was the cost of underestimating quiet resilience, the consequences of confusing patience with passivity. As I returned to my seat I smoothed the fabric of my coat with deliberate care, aware that every movement now carried a significance I had not sought but would no longer shrink from, and I allowed myself a small private certainty that the outcome of this day would extend far beyond property lines and legal filings, reaching into the future with the same quiet persistence that had guided me through a lifetime of unseen battles. The afternoon light had shifted by the time the judge called for a brief recess, and the courtroom exhaled in a collective murmur that sounded almost like relief, as though everyone present understood that something irreversible had begun yet needed a moment to settle into its new shape. I remained seated while others stood and stretched, the wooden bench beneath me firm and familiar in a way that reminded me of long faculty meetings where patience was tested not by hostility but by endurance. Daniel stepped into the aisle with his attorney, their heads bent together in urgent conversation that carried a different tone now, sharper at the edges, stripped of the casual certainty that had framed his laughter earlier that morning. I did not strain to hear their words. There are times when distance offers more clarity than proximity, and I had learned over the years that observing quietly often revealed truths that direct confrontation only obscured. Instead, I allowed my gaze to rest on the tall windows where bare branches traced delicate patterns against a pale November sky, and I thought about the many seasons that had passed inside the house on Maplewood Drive, The winters when Robert and I had watched snow accumulate along the porch railing. The springs when Daniel had rushed in with muddy shoes and stories about schoolyard triumphs that seemed monumental in their innocence. Memory has a way of returning uninvited at moments of transition, as though the past itself wishes to bear witness to the choices being made in the present. When the judge rose and left the bench, he paused briefly near the clerk's desk, exchanging a few quiet words that I could not quite make out, and then he glanced in my direction with an expression that held both recognition and something like resolve. It was not the deferential respect of a former student alone, but the measured consideration of a jurist weighing the full human context of a dispute that had been presented as merely administrative. My attorney approached with a reassuring nod, speaking in low tones about the significance of the documents we had introduced and the shifting dynamics they had set into motion, yet I found myself listening only partially, aware that the true transformation unfolding here was less about legal strategy and more about perception, about the gradual unveiling of a life that had been too easily summarized by others. Daniel returned to his seat after several minutes, his posture more rigid than before, his fingers tapping restlessly against the edge of the table as though trying to summon the confidence that had once come so effortlessly. When our eyes finally met across the narrow distance separating us, I saw not hostility but a dawning unease, the kind that arises when familiar assumptions begin to dissolve under the steady light of new understanding. I offered him the faintest of smiles, not as a gesture of triumph but as an acknowledgement of the complexity we now shared, the realization that neither of us could return unchanged from what was taking place in this room. The bailiff's voice soon called us back to order, and as we rose once more I felt a quiet steadiness anchor itself within me, a sense that the years I had spent guiding others through ethical dilemmas had prepared me for this very confrontation with ambiguity and consequence. The judge resumed his seat with renewed focus, reviewing the filings with a care that suggested he was no longer merely adjudicating a property matter but engaging with a broader question of accountability, and when he invited further testimony his tone carried an openness that encouraged truth rather than performance. I spoke again, this time about the intentions behind my silence in the months leading up to this hearing, about the deliberate choice to observe rather than react, to gather clarity rather than escalate confusion. I described the night I had almost left the envelope unopened, the instinctive desire to preserve harmony even at personal cost, and the eventual recognition that dignity sometimes requires the courage to disrupt the narratives others have written on our behalf. As my words settled into the attentive quiet, I sensed the courtroom leaning closer not out of curiosity alone but out of a growing respect for the quiet architecture of resilience that had shaped my response. Daniel's attorney posed a series of questions that attempted to frame my actions as calculated maneuvering, yet the judge intervened with gentle firmness, reminding all present that foresight is not synonymous with manipulation, and that preparation can be an expression of self-respect rather than hostility. In that moment I understood that the balance had shifted decisively, not through spectacle but through the cumulative weight of lived experience finally given voice, and as I returned once more to my seat I allowed myself to breathe fully, aware that whatever verdict would eventually be rendered, the deeper outcome had already begun to redefine the boundaries of how I would be seen, and more importantly, how I would see myself. The air in the courtroom felt different now, as if the invisible lines of hierarchy that once placed me at the very edge of relevance had quietly rearranged themselves, and I became aware of how every small movement carried a new weight that I had not sought yet could no longer deny. The judge reviewed additional exhibits with deliberate patience, his fingers turning each page as though acknowledging the care with which they had been assembled, and in that simple act I sensed the unspoken validation of years spent believing that quiet preparation was rarely noticed but always meaningful. Daniel remained seated across from me, his posture upright but tense, the easy confidence that had defined him earlier replaced by a restless alertness that reminded me of the boy who once waited outside my study door before exams, unsure whether he would meet expectations he barely understood. I wondered if he remembered those evenings as clearly as I did, the way I had guided him through difficult assignments not with lectures but with questions designed to help him discover his own reasoning. Teaching had always been less about delivering answers than about cultivating awareness, and as I watched him now I realized that awareness had finally arrived, though not in the context either of us might have chosen. My attorney requested permission to introduce testimony from a financial consultant who had assisted me in tracing the series of transactions that had reshaped ownership of the Maplewood property without my informed consent, and the consultant spoke in steady, professional tones that translated complex figures into a narrative of assumption and oversight, a story of how systems can be navigated by those who believe themselves entitled to do so. There was no accusation in his voice, only clarity, and I felt a quiet gratitude for the way facts can illuminate paths that emotion alone cannot travel. The judge listened intently, occasionally making notes that seemed to anchor each detail within a broader framework of fairness, and I understood then that the law, when approached with integrity, has the capacity to restore balance not through punishment but through recognition. Daniel's attorney rose to cross-examine, his questions probing the margins of interpretation, suggesting alternative readings of the documents that might preserve the narrative he had built around inevitability and practicality, yet each attempt seemed to dissolve under the patient light of verification. I remained still, hands folded, aware that my role in this unfolding moment was not to persuade through force but to witness through presence, to embody the resilience that had carried me from the quiet discovery of an unopened envelope to this public reclamation of voice. Outside the windows the late afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the courthouse lawn where a few scattered leaves skittered along the pavement like thoughts unwilling to settle. Time, I reflected, has a way of revealing what urgency often obscures, and perhaps this entire process had been less about contesting ownership than about confronting the assumptions that had accumulated between Daniel and me over decades of shared but differently understood experience. When the judge invited him to speak once more, Daniel hesitated before rising, his gaze moving briefly toward me as though searching for a familiar script that no longer applied. He spoke about responsibility and forward planning, about the pressures of maintaining assets in an unpredictable economy, and I recognized the sincerity beneath his carefully chosen words, even as I sensed their incompleteness. We had both been operating within narratives shaped by fear of loss, his fear of financial instability and mine of emotional erasure, and the collision of those fears had brought us to this crossroads where truth demanded acknowledgement from both sides. The judge thanked him with a nod that conveyed neither approval nor dismissal, only the measured respect owed to any individual willing to articulate their perspective under scrutiny. As Daniel resumed his seat, I felt a subtle shift within myself, a loosening of the tension that had accompanied me for months, replaced by a clarity that extended beyond the outcome of this hearing. Whatever the verdict, I realized the deeper victory lay in the restoration of my own sense of authorship over the story of my life. The woman who had once accepted invisibility as the cost of harmony was no longer content to exist as a footnote in someone else's plans. And as the proceedings moved steadily toward their conclusion, I allowed that realization to settle within me like the final note of a long and complicated symphony, resonant and unmistakably my own. By the time the final phase of the hearing began, the light outside had turned the soft amber of early evening, and the long shadows cast across the courtroom floor seemed to stretch like quiet reminders that time does not pause for uncertainty, no matter how desperately we might wish it would. The judge reviewed his notes with the measured patience that had come to define the rhythm of this day, and I noticed how the room itself had grown more attentive, as though every person present understood that we were approaching the moment when observation would give way to conclusion. My attorney leaned slightly toward me, speaking in low reassuring tones about procedural expectations, yet I found that my thoughts had drifted elsewhere, toward the countless hours I had once spent guiding students through the disciplined art of argument, teaching them that clarity is not achieved through volume but through conviction shaped by reflection. Daniel sat across from me, his expression composed yet unmistakably altered, the earlier ease replaced by a gravity that seemed to have settled into his posture like an unfamiliar coat. He no longer tapped his fingers or shifted impatiently. Instead, he watched the judge with an intensity that suggested he was beginning to understand the broader dimensions of what was at stake. I realized then that this hearing had become more than a contest over property or procedure, more even than a confrontation between differing interpretations of responsibility. It had become a mirror in which both of us were forced to recognize the narratives we had accepted without question, the roles we had assigned to one another in the quiet theater of family life. When the judge invited closing statements, the attorneys rose in turn, their voices steady and deliberate, summarizing weeks of preparation in phrases designed to guide perception toward a desired conclusion. Daniel's counsel spoke of progress and practicality, of the need to adapt to changing circumstances with decisive action, framing the contested decisions as necessary steps taken in good faith. My attorney responded with a different emphasis, highlighting the importance of transparency and consent, reminding the court that dignity cannot be measured in square footage or market forecasts. As I listened, I felt neither anger nor triumph but a curious sense of distance, as though the woman who had once been wounded by dismissal was now observing the unfolding resolution with the calm curiosity of a scholar studying a case study she already understood. The judge then turned his attention directly to me, asking whether I wished to add anything further before he rendered his decision. For a moment the question seemed to echo beyond the walls of the courtroom, reaching back through decades of quiet compromise and unspoken endurance. And I realized that what I might say now would not alter the documents already entered into evidence, but could shape the meaning of this day for both Daniel and myself. I rose slowly, aware of the subtle creak of the bench behind me, and the way every gaze in the room settled with quiet expectation upon my face. I spoke not of blame but of legacy, of the invisible labor that sustains families across generations, and the mutual responsibility to honor that labor even when ambitions pull us in divergent directions. I acknowledged Daniel's desire to secure his future, recognizing in it the same determination I had once encouraged in him as a boy learning to navigate the world beyond our front door. Yet I also described the loneliness that accompanies being quietly written out of decisions that shape one's own home. My words were simple, measured, offered without accusation, and as they settled into the attentive silence I sensed a subtle release within myself, as though a long-held breath had finally been exhaled. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, then looked up again with an expression I could not fully name, something between regret and awakening, and I understood that whatever judgment would soon be spoken, a different kind of reckoning had already begun within him. The judge inclined his head in acknowledgement before turning back to his notes, and the faint rustle of paper carried the unmistakable promise that this chapter of our shared story was approaching its turning point, one shaped not by spectacle but by the quiet authority of truth finally given room to stand. The silence that followed the closing statements did not feel empty but charged, as if the entire room were suspended in a delicate balance between what had been assumed and what was about to be acknowledged, and I found myself listening not only to the faint hum of the overhead lights but to the quieter rhythm of my own breathing, steady and grounded in a way that reminded me of standing before a lecture hall moments before beginning a difficult lesson. The judge rested his hands lightly on the bench, his gaze moving from one side of the courtroom to the other with an attentiveness that suggested he was weighing more than legal arguments alone, and when he finally began to speak his voice carried a calm authority shaped by both training and memory. He summarized the facts with careful precision, outlining the sequence of financial decisions and property transfers that had brought us to this point, yet beneath the formal language I could hear an undercurrent of something more reflective, an acknowledgement that disputes rooted in family carry complexities no statute can fully anticipate. As he spoke I became aware of Daniel watching him with an intensity that bordered on disbelief, as though he were hearing a version of events that no longer aligned with the narrative he had rehearsed so confidently in the weeks leading up to this day. The judge paused briefly before continuing, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet recognition that felt less like favor and more like the natural consequence of years spent in shared intellectual pursuit. And in that moment I understood that influence does not fade simply because it is no longer visible. He referred to principles of transparency and mutual consent, emphasizing that stewardship of family assets requires not only foresight but also respect for those whose lives are intertwined with their legacy. And I felt a subtle warmth rise within me, not of triumph but of affirmation that the values I had once insisted upon in crowded classrooms had found resonance beyond the walls of academia. Daniel's attorney shifted uneasily, shuffling papers that suddenly seemed less persuasive, while my own counsel remained still beside me, his quiet confidence mirroring the steadiness I had fought to reclaim. Outside the windows the sky had deepened into a muted blue, the last traces of sunlight fading like the remnants of an argument no longer worth sustaining. The judge then addressed the specific remedies he believed appropriate, speaking of corrective measures and the restoration of rightful agency with a clarity that left little room for misinterpretation. And as his words settled into the attentive silence I sensed the collective awareness of those present crystallize into understanding. Daniel's shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly, the tension that had defined his posture giving way to a realization that seemed both sobering and strangely liberating, as though the weight of maintaining a flawed certainty had finally been lifted. When the judge concluded he inclined his head slightly in my direction, a gesture so restrained it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not attuned to its significance. And I recognized within it not only respect for who I had been but acknowledgement of who I remained. The bailiff announced the adjournment in a measured tone, and the courtroom began to stir with the subdued movements of people preparing to return to their own unfinished stories. Yet I lingered for a moment longer, absorbing the quiet transformation that had taken place within me. This was not the dramatic victory some might have expected, no sudden reversal accompanied by raised voices or grand declarations, but something far more enduring, a restoration of balance achieved through patience and truth. As I gathered my handbag and rose from the bench, I caught Daniel's gaze once more, and, in the fragile openness of his expression, I saw the first glimmer of a conversation we had yet to have, one that would require both of us to reconsider the assumptions that had carried us to this threshold. Without speaking, I offered him the same small, steady smile that had sustained me through months of uncertainty, and as I turned toward the aisle I felt a lightness that had nothing to do with property lines or legal outcomes and everything to do with the quiet certainty that my voice, once dismissed as irrelevant, had finally been heard. The hallway outside the courtroom felt wider than it had that morning, as though the simple act of stepping beyond those heavy wooden doors had opened not only a physical passage but a quieter path forward that I had not fully allowed myself to imagine. The muted sounds of clerks organizing paperwork and distant footsteps echoing along polished tile floors formed a gentle backdrop to the steady rhythm of my own thoughts, and I paused for a moment beside a tall window where the last traces of daylight lingered like a promise that endings can also be beginnings. Daniel emerged a few steps behind me, his expression still carrying the weight of realization, yet there was something softer there now, a vulnerability that reminded me of the countless evenings long ago when he had stood uncertain in the doorway of my study, seeking reassurance he did not yet know how to request. We did not speak immediately. Silence has always been a language of its own in our family, sometimes protective, sometimes wounding, and now it seemed to offer a fragile space in which new understanding might take root. I adjusted the strap of my handbag on my shoulder and became aware of how light it felt, no longer burdened by the quiet accumulation of unanswered questions that had accompanied me for months. The documents inside had served their purpose not merely by influencing a legal outcome, but by restoring a sense of agency I had once believed irretrievably lost. As we walked slowly toward the courthouse exit, the late autumn air pressed cool and clarifying against my face, carrying with it the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant traffic, reminders that life beyond this building continued in its ordinary persistence. Daniel finally spoke my name, his voice careful, stripped of the casual certainty that had once framed every conversation between us, and in that single word I heard an invitation rather than a challenge. He did not apologize immediately. Instead he spoke about confusion, about the pressures he had felt to secure stability in a world that seemed increasingly unpredictable, about how easy it had been to mistake efficiency for responsibility. I listened without interruption, recognizing in his halting explanations the early stages of the awareness I had always hoped to cultivate in those I taught, the willingness to confront complexity without retreating into defensiveness. When he finished, I told him quietly that understanding often arrives later than we would prefer, yet its timing does not diminish its value. We stood together on the courthouse steps watching the evening settle across the city in shades of blue and gold, and for the first time since Robert's passing I sensed the possibility that our relationship might be rebuilt not on the unspoken hierarchies of the past, but on a more honest recognition of each other's fears and hopes. The house on Maplewood Drive would remain a shared point of negotiation in practical terms, yet it no longer defined the entirety of what lay between us. I thought about the lecture halls of my earlier life, about the young faces that had once looked to me for guidance, and I realized that mentorship does not conclude with retirement or even with the closing of a courtroom session. It continues in the quiet choices we make to engage rather than withdraw, to teach through presence rather than instruction. As Daniel offered to walk me to my car, I accepted with a small nod, aware that this simple gesture carried more significance than any dramatic declaration could have. We moved through the parking lot beneath a sky now scattered with the first faint stars, our footsteps falling into an unhurried rhythm that felt almost like the beginning of a conversation long deferred. When we reached the driver's door, I turned to him and spoke of boundaries, of the importance of honoring the voices that have shaped our lives even when ambition urges us to move swiftly ahead, and he listened with a seriousness that suggested the lesson had finally found its place. As I settled behind the wheel and started the engine, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle within me, not the sharp edge of victory but the deeper steadiness of self-recognition restored. The road ahead stretched into the evening, illuminated by the steady glow of streetlights. And as I drove away from the courthouse, I understood that the true resolution of this day would unfold not in legal documents but in the renewed authorship of my own story, written with the same patience and clarity that had guided me through every unseen battle I had ever faced.